Tonight we have a panel of seasoned ACT project leaders who will share their experiences, and along with their seasoning, there's an awful lot of seasoning out here in the audience too. So we have Fred Tiemann, who's an MBA from the class of '67. He has led 6 full-team projects and 2 fast-track projects. Cynthia Dye from the class of '93, and she has led 5 projects and served as a team member on one and a specialist on another. Dave Hoyt, a member of the class of '79 and also a member of the ACT Board of Directors, has led 7 full-team projects, served on a team member on 4 full-team projects, led 1 advisor forum and 1 fast-track project. So that gives you a brief introduction to their ACT background.
I started ACT in about '96. I've been doing about a project a year since then. Primarily got in just the old adage, give something back to the community. There was a project in my hometown, Redwood City, and so I grabbed it and liked how it worked, and been doing an occasional project since then.
I do ACT projects because it's a great way to give back to the community, and it's a great way to keep in touch with the GSB community and meet all those great alumni that you always hear about that you never really had a chance to meet while you were actually in school. So it's just a lot of fun, and it's a great way to have a lot of impact in a pretty structured format.
I first got involved with ACT back in the early 90s, maybe 1990, and have been doing about a project a year, give or take, and really found that that's where my closest personal relationships with alumni are, because I work with those people and see the people that I know through ACT on a regular basis, as opposed to my classmates who I see every 5 years at reunions. So anyway, it's been a great way for me to get involved and to see some really interesting clients doing things that I'm interested in, and also to establish relationships with alums that have become good friends over the years.
Our program tonight, we're dividing it into 3 major topic areas. The first will be project screening and due diligence. The second topic will be project definition, and the third will be team and project management. We will start with project screening and due diligence, and Fred will kick that one off.
All right. I picked this is the topic of influence to introduce, primarily because screening has always been a mystery to me in terms of what a good project looks like. And the real problem is, how do you ensure that when you get down the road on any particular project, it's going to be a rewarding experience, rewarding for the client, rewarding for the team, rewarding for yourself, that this makes something that you want to do again, and it doesn't come unraveled on you. And how do you recognize that early on so you can avoid those things that are not an appropriate ACT project? And I guess I don't know what an appropriate ACT project is, and probably wouldn't know if I stumbled over it, but we can play with it. I just finished a project with the YWCA of the Mid-Peninsula in Palo Alto, which is kind of a stalking horse for asking a lot of these questions. And I'll talk more about that in the various segments as we go down the line. But this was a project that we may or may not should have done. And were there any warning signs in the front end that said that we'd feel this way coming out on the back end? There's a few that I can think of. And the first one was that it was an old application. The application had been, the YWCA had not had an ED for 5 years, having lost the one they had years ago that had been there for 20 years, and they just hired a new one finally. And this application was put in place just before that ED came in, and had not been updated since the ED, who had been there about 9 months now, was in place. So it was an old application, probably not completely bought in, maybe a little out of date, not enough to worry about. Didn't have any current financials, which should have been a danger signal because we didn't know how much trouble they were in financially. And it would be, the initial screening would say, if you're working with an old application, get a new one, get it updated, get it signed off by the current people, make sure everybody's on board. The next thing was that when we had our first meeting, the board was there. There were four board members were there, and the ED were there, and they were very, very supportive, and they were just excited, and they were thrilled that we were going to be there to help them out, and they just couldn't say enough. And even if we'd wanted to, I don't think we could have said no. It was just, it kind of gets to you. And so perhaps the message there is that first meeting is not a kickoff meeting or a planning meeting. It's an interview. They should not have the impression that they have been accepted, which I think they do have in all the projects I've been on. But it's an interview, part of the interviewing process, so that at least you have a chance, if you see some red flags, to either get those resolved or back out or agree that this is not the right kind of a thing for an ACT project, or whatever the outcome happens to be. At least you got a shot at it, rather than getting that roped in feeling. And finally, another read, which we got a positive read on, was that are they flexible and are they accessible and are they willing to participate and be part of the project? Are they going to be working with you and willing to play? And interestingly enough, with the exception of the first one, the Y met those with flying colors. They had good board members, great new ED, were very willing to listen, and we scoped down the project, all those kinds of things. And so coming out of the chute, we were in reasonably solid ground. And I guess the sum total of all that message is look for those things and keep the back door open just in case.
I guess a couple of additional comments. One, to build on your comment about being very clear up front on understanding exactly who the client is. And by that I mean specific individuals. And sometimes the client is management, the executive director generally, and sometimes it's the board, and sometimes it's both. And it's very important to kind of establish that up front. The one situation where I had a project blow up on me early was one where basically the president of the board was the main instigator in trying to bring ACT in, and really didn't have the buy-in of the ED. And when we started talking to the executive director, that became apparent. And then, very early on in the process, probably about a week in when we were having these discussions, executive director resigned. So that was the end of that project. But it just kind of emphasizes the point of, try to establish up front, who you're working for and who's going to be doing what with the results, and kind of get that all out of the way. The other thing is, once you've kind of established, who the project is for, then you actually need to understand who will be kind of the designated ACT contact. And you need to, again, emphasize that it's ideal to have one rather than, you can just talk to, all of our managers, which becomes really muddy. If the project isn't really owned by anyone within the organization, then that also is kind of a red flag. Sometimes in a small organization, that person is the executive director. In large organizations that may have more staff members, it might be owned by, the development director, or might be owned by, the programs people or something. And it's important to know who your kind of day-to-day ACT contact is going to be. One other situation I just came across recently with my current project, which is Women's Initiative for Self-Employment. The project they had originally asked for, which had gone through the ACT screening process. So by the time I received it, it was supposed to be a marketing plan. As I went in through my little exercise of finding out who the client was and what they wanted and everything, it turned out that they had also they had just recently been told that they were the recipient of a Taproot Foundation grant as well. And that was also in marketing. And that could be okay if it was clearly delineated, but it became apparent it wasn't, because it was about positioning and messaging, and for them logos as well. But the messaging and positioning part was going to start to impact our project, and they were going to start earlier than we were, when it was kind of obvious we should have gone first, since we were doing more of the strategic planning part of it. So that sounded just really messy. And so it took me a couple of sessions, but I finally convinced the executive director that was not going to be a very clean ACT project, and not going to be a good experience for the volunteers if they didn't have something that they could own, which is perhaps the most important thing, is to try to carve out a project that the team can really take responsibility for and own. In terms of what is an appropriate project, because of the nature of ACT. It's a volunteer process. There are multiple volunteers. People put in, relatively limited amounts of time per month, and it stretches out over several months usually. Planning projects tend to be more appropriate projects than anything that has to do with implementation. And what you'll find of a lot, and the ACT office is pretty good at screening the really obvious ones out, but you'll have people who ask for marketing plans that are kind of thinly disguised as fundraising plans. And what they really want is for all of these great GSB grads with all of their wonderful, well-heeled friends, to give them money. And if you kind of ask a few more questions, they really want this kind of dialing for dollars type of thing. And that's really not going to be very rewarding for any ACT volunteer. So you want to kind of understand if it's marketing, is it really marketing? Is it kind of strategic marketing, or is this, how many grant makers can you get me in touch with, or how many well-heeled individual donors can you add to my list of contacts? Anything implementation oriented, like we're not in the business of helping them build websites. I mean, anything like that is pretty much out. So you can pretty much get a sense of that when you're talking to the executive director. Also understand that there are time limitations. So there are projects that are just going to take too much time and therefore are not appropriate for a bunch of ACT volunteers. Generally, there will be some kind of research involved, some kind of information gathering, and that phase in every kind of project. So, for example, if it's market research, what I like to say is it's generally okay if we're doing kind of, a couple of spot interviews and trying to get a qualitative feel for the market, but, it's unlikely an ACT team is going to be able to do justice to a really quantitative market research project. So that's the other thing to keep in mind.
I was really recently decided that this is a really important issue, and one that I don't think a lot of, I think, at least certainly in the way I have in the past approached leading projects and have observed others as well, I think one that we need to think about how we approach them. And this became particularly apparent to me the other day, or a couple of months ago, when the ACT board was reviewing past projects. And there's a part of the board, a group in the board that does the surveys, of course, Rudy used to do that, and Brian's on the committee. But the presentation had to do with, part of the presentation listed several of the projects, there were about 4 or 5, that did very poorly in the ratings. And you could see as they were graphed that these were just outliers. And there were some descriptions as to each of these projects and things that happened poorly with them. The common element, as you looked at this list, was these are projects that we probably shouldn't have been doing in the first place. I was particularly aware of that because one of them was one that I led. And I knew it was going to be on the list. It was a project where the client folded the week before the final presentation. Actually, its parent folded them. And I realized that when I go into the first, when I had gone into the first scoping screening meetings before the team is formed, that my approach had been, how am I going to make this project work? That's the wrong first question. That's the second question. The first question needs to be, should we be doing this project? And I think a lot of people, when you start, you get this list from Laura, and it's got all these interesting looking projects, and there's an organization that you really want to work with, and you want to help make them successful, and you just want to make it work. But if that's the way you start the process, you're liable to miss clues that maybe this isn't going to be a good project. Because the only screening that's done before it comes to us as leaders for those first face-to-face meetings, the only screening that's done is done by paper and by telephone with Laura and Ed Best. And they do a great job of weeding out the obvious stuff But until you get face to face, you can't necessarily find the other things. Now, I don't know, looking back on it, whether I could have figured out that this was a wrong client to be taking on, but I could have asked some different questions. It was a client that was just getting a new executive director. We met with the new executive director. She was really gung-ho. It was trying to help them get data that would help them establish their forward-looking strategy, which was going to be changing from what they'd done in the past. She was all gung-ho. This was going to be stuff that she was going to be using to help make the strategy. We thought, oh, this is wonderful. The board member of the parent organization that was sponsoring it was all gung-ho. Well, their budget for this part of the organization looked great, but the questions we didn't ask were, what is the budget and the financials for the parent organization? We didn't ask to talk to other directors who weren't tied in with this particular subsidiary organization. Our whole approach in this process was, how can we make it work, not should we be doing this project in the first place. So in the future, when I go out to lead projects and go through that first phase, I'm going to be much more cognizant of that question as the first one that I think about. And my frame of reference, my mindset will be different in that process. Once I'm convinced that, yes, we should, then I switch to okay, how do we make this work?
Okay, well, with that, we will move into the project definition phase. So this is Dave's second question of how to make it work. And Cynthia will start off on this topic.
Just remember, this is like any consulting project. It's all about managing expectations. And so the more that you can help your client, which of course by now you've determined who your real client is, the board or your executive director or both, the more that you can help them understand about the ACT process, the more that they will self-select out and help define a project that's going to be rewarding for them and for your ACT team. So what I like to do is the first meeting, my first face-to-face meeting, is really explain about the ACT process, because after all, we're a nonprofit also, and we have stakeholders also. And, important part of ACT is making sure that, our supply of volunteers, continues to grow, and that people have a great experience and really want to sign up and volunteer for the next project. And I find that if you communicate that to the client, that they're, very sympathetic and want to help you make sure that happens. And really it's about, making sure that ACT can go forth and help other nonprofits as well, so that other people will benefit from this experience. So really I try to position this piece of the project as, how can you help me sell this project to the volunteers? I mean, what's going to make this project sexy for volunteers? I mean, we want to get a great ACT team, don't we? And have all the right people with the great skills and have them be very enthusiastic about doing this project. And of course, as a GSB alum yourself, you can give them a clue of what is sexy from a ACT volunteers point of view. And then, of course, they obviously want to get some things done too. And so, it's a process of negotiation, figuring out what's going to work for the team and what's going to accomplish the goals and objectives the client has. I mean, obviously, there's a range of different alums, and what's going to be sexy to one is not necessarily going to be sexy to the other, but that also is going to help you write your little description, which we have to turn into Laura, as to what kind of team you want, what kind of skill sets you're going to look for. So, it needs to be sexy to the target group of volunteers that you're going to be getting, if it's, some kind of financial analysis piece, or if it's a strategic planning project, or if it's a marketing-based project, or what have you. But I find there's usually two things that make people interested. One is either the organization itself is sexy by itself. I mean, I can give you a good example. Roger got to do a project that was pretty sexy, I think, for Habitat. Of course, I was the client on that end, but Habitat for Humanity. And it's a pretty sexy organization. It's well known. People think they do good work. And there are a lot of people who are going to sign up just because the organization is really interesting. I had that same phenomenon with Women's Initiative. A ton of people signed up for my project, more than I needed actually, probably mostly because they were interested in what the organization did. So there are going to be some organizations that are just going to benefit from their, brand, so to speak. And then if they're not, a well-known nonprofit, then you're going to have to work harder on the actual project to make it sound interesting. And I think what is sexy to GSB volunteers is really projects that have an impact, that will really be a turning point for the organization or help them make some very big decision or what have you. That's my opinion. My fellow panelists may have some other things.
You get sexy and we get Coco the Gorilla.
That's sexy. So there's a couple of other things that I think are important. One I mentioned already, which is making sure to carve out a project that the ACT team can own. I think that's also a sexy thing. It's not sexy if Taproot does half of your project for you. That is not sexy, right? So that was what I had to explain to Women's Initiative. The other thing is figuring out the timing. I mean, Caroline mentioned this problem. Part of explaining the ACT process is explaining, when does the team start and how much time we're going to spend on each phase, and that there's going to be this mid-course review in the middle, and just making sure they understand when are we going to be done. Because if they have a real deadline, then, there is the possibility your ACT team will not meet that deadline. And you want to have something that's not really hard and fast. You want to have something where there's a little bit of flexibility, because you might discover something in the first half of the project and present something at the mid-course review that becomes a showstopper at that point. So, I think it's important to keep that in mind, is looking at what are the real deadlines. If it's strategic, it shouldn't be something that needs to be done next month. I mean, that's another clue in your screening. So look at deadlines that would potentially impact the client and help them understand, it's going to be 6 months before you see results. So if you need to see something before then, that may not work, and maybe we need to redefine this project. And then another thing I would say is put yourself in the client's shoes in terms of, what's going to be a worthwhile outcome for them. Look for kind of high leverage tasks that might be easy for MBAs, but might be, particularly difficult for people in the nonprofit sector. I mean, we really do think differently, and things that we may not think is a big deal are a really big deal and real eye-openers for people in the nonprofit side of things. An example here, a project that I led on San Mateo Public Library, we did a project that helped them evaluate new businesses. And one of our leave behinds was a framework to help them do that on their own, which was very exciting for them. And it was very simple for us. I mean, we just came up with 10, defining questions and, made an easy scoring system and put it together. And it really didn't take the team that long to do, but it had a huge impact for them. And they were very proud of their framework. And another big thing we did is to teach them the concept of opportunity cost, which was just mind-blowing for them. And that was something that they used continuously. And it's a business concept that, again, not a big deal for us, but passing that along to them was a really big deal. I would say that consultants are generally hired for a few reasons. One is that, expertise that you don't have. Another might be your ability to tap certain resources that would be difficult for the nonprofit to tap, such as contacts that might be easy for us to have, or doing competitive interviews. It's very common to hire third parties to do that for you. And third is getting extra resources to investigate projects that staff do not have time to do, so extra hands type of thing. So those are some things to think about. They're general, I think, for all consulting, but things to think about in trying to define, a project that would be worthwhile and rewarding for the client. Ask for the right skill set for your team. Once you've, figured out what your project is, make sure it's going to be sexy to the right group of people. So think about how they might implement things as well. So, there may be organizational issues. So try to actually think broadly. I find the broader list of skills that you put down that you think might be relevant to your project. Generally, you'll get a much better group of volunteers who think they have those skills. And then I think we were supposed to address a little bit about the work plan itself. In terms of a general framework, there's, a couple of, I think all projects are pretty much the same. You're going to start with defining what your goals and objectives are, come up with some basic hypotheses and assumptions that you're going to start with. There will be a data gathering phase of some sort. For some projects, it's very intense. For some projects, it's very short. Some piece of analysis that you will do on that data you've gathered, and then you'll develop some kind of recommendations based usually on some type of framework, and then spend some time figuring out how to present that in an understandable way. And this is actually a really important step and something to spend some time discussing. How do you present the results in a way that's going to stick with your client? One thing that we're doing with the Women's Initiative, for example, the project was to do a feasibility study, which was cut back from doing a full business plan, by the way. We've decided to present that by drawing on their own course material. Women's Initiative is an organization that trains low-income women to start their own businesses. So we're going to use our own course material to present that to them. And the comment we got from our main contact there was, gee, this is a real Dr. Heal Thyself moment. So focus on that. Look at key deliverables in your work plan and revisit your work plan, many times during the project. I think this is like a typical consulting kind of thing. It's like, this is what we agreed on. This is what we told you we were going to tell you. Here, now we're telling you. This is what we told you about it. So, we will get requests in the middle to do more. And it's really important to say, well, this is what we agreed on for the scope, and to kind of stick to that scope. Now, if your team agrees to do more, that's a different story. I mean, again, this is a volunteer project. If everybody wants to do it, that's great, And then finally, just be careful about taking on too much. There's an enthusiasm, particularly when you're a new project leader, to, really want to do a big project. Keep in mind that, when the ACT office tells people you'll put in 10 to 15 hours per month per volunteer, keep in mind that includes meetings, regular meeting times for your team, potentially. So how much time does that really leave to do a lot of the work and, figure out what's going to be reasonable?
If we can go back to the question of project definition, just a couple of points I wanted to make. This is the time, I think the most important part of this, how do we make it work, is project scope. This is the time when you focus on the project scope. I've done about a dozen projects. I'm not sure about all of them, but probably most of them started out a whole lot bigger than they should have been, and much bigger than they ended up. And narrowing it down so that you're focusing, as Cynthia said, on the things that are most highly leveraged, but also that work into the time frame and resources that you have is, I think, really, really critical, and that's where to focus your attention. Particularly be careful if you're doing a project, if you're leading a project in the fall round, which is going to be a fact project with students, because they're great projects. I've done 2 of them, and it's really terrific to have the combined student alumni teams, but it does impose a different set of restrictions as far as the length of time that the project can go, because you can't go past really May, right? And also some of the issues with respect to people's time. There are times in the school year where the students really can't focus on the ACT project. So that's something to keep in mind with respect to scoping a project that is going to be a combined student alumni project. One other thing, kind of along those lines, I led a project with San Mateo City Libraries after Cynthia did, about 2 years later. They were still using her framework. We came in, and this was a fact project with students, so it had to be relatively constrained as far as its scope. Our project was to develop a strategic plan. Now, within a limited amount of time and resources, that developing a whole strategic plan for them really wasn't practical. It also wasn't very efficient for anybody involved, because they were the ones that had to really come up with what they were going to do and all. What we ended up doing was learning about their organization, developing a process for them to go through, and that allowed us within our limited resources to add a high level of value to them that then they could go. And I met with them a year later, and they were working through it, and they had all kinds of questions. And but again, that was part of the scoping process, and I think that's probably the most important issue when it comes to this time between when you've decided that yes, you should do the project, and when you actually have the team on board.
You do a work plan, and then you get downstream, and you got to change it. And it's just a matter of course. So consequently, the initial work plan, which if you follow the frame of things, is you have your initial meeting, and then you scope the project, and you send in the description, and then you go back to the client and work through and detail out a work plan. And then you get a team, and then you have your team meeting, and you sell the work plan to the team. Not really. What happens is that I think the big value of the work plan is to help solidify in the client's mind what the scope is really all about, what's going to happen. You can say, here's the objectives and here's what we're going to do, but they really don't get it until you sit down and say, okay, and this is how we're going to get there. And then they can begin to see, oh, yeah, you're going to do some interviews. Oh, yeah, you'll do some data collection. Oh, yeah, I understand that now. And what about this? Oh, that's out of scope. Okay, well, that's why it's not in the work plan. And you can work through those kinds of things to the point that all of a sudden you begin to generate a decent understanding. Also, it gives you a lot more data points if you aren't got a project that's going to be in trouble. That interaction is going to help you begin to dig out some of those things. Oh, you can't interview those people because they don't like us, or you can't interview them because they're never around, or those kinds of things start to come out, and then the red flags start to pop up at that point, and so it gives you another chance to digest what's really going on and say, wait a minute, now why not? Why doesn't this board member like you? How come these board members never come to meetings? That sort of thing that begin to say, hey, there's a little trouble in paradise here. And so I like to make the work plan as general as possible in terms of the specifics, but focus it on communicating with the client. And then when the time comes and the team comes together, it's not a matter of selling, but it's another iteration of that work plan, because in order to get the team buy-in, you really got to make it a participative thing. I mean, these aren't silly people or dumb people that you're dealing with. Most of them are smarter than I am, and you've got to give them a shot to work it, buy into it, understand what it's all about, and make the project go from that standpoint. So that's the other side of the coin, is working it through from there, and then give it your damnedest. When you start going to that data collection thing, something's going to change, and you're going to have to reiterate and rework it through and sit down with the client and understand it. It happens. It's just one of those things, and so expect it. But that's why you shouldn't get too wed to that work plan beyond, I think, communicating with the client, at least in the initial phases.
We can move right into team and project management, and Dave will kick this one up.
I think that the leader has really three areas of responsibility with respect to team and project management. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but the first is just organizing the team and assigning the responsibilities for the work. Second is the client interface. The leaders are the primary client interface throughout the project, typically. And third is getting the project to the end. Because there's always a time, and you've all done projects, and you get about halfway through, maybe a little bit more than halfway through, and it just sort of seems like you're never going to get to the end. And that always happens, and yet you always get to the end. And I think that just recognizing that you're going to go through that, typically you're going to go through that period, is helpful. I always know, okay, well, I'm at that point. I know how this feels, and I know we're going to get through. But the people who are doing their first project may not recognize that this is a normal thing, and the leader sort of has to just, kind of keep the momentum going and keep, and reassure the team members, particularly the new ones, that yes, we will finish this, and it will be a good experience. Let's go back. I want to go back to the organization of the team for a moment. That's really the main thing that I want to talk about, and I won't be terribly long. I think this starts at the scoping of the project in the first place. As part of that scoping, as part of the working out of the preliminary, I agree with Fred, I never have a final work plan until a team gets together because they need to buy into it. They need to be part of it. But as part of the thinking through that process, I think it's really important to figure out, okay, of these, say, 6 people I'm going to have on this team, how am I going to break that down into meaningful chunks of work? Because if you just have an amorphous batch of 6 people trying to do stuff, everybody's going to get frustrated. If you've got 5 things that need doing and you've got 1 person on each thing, then they're going to feel a sense of responsibility, they're going to feel a motivation, and they're going to get a sense of accomplishment when it's done. Probably one of the best teams that I was on was one that Brian and I led for Community School of Music and Arts a few years ago. And what were there, 5 people on that team, maybe 5, something like that. And I think every individual had their own responsibility. I don't think it was pairs. It was every individual had their own responsibility. It was a really excellent team. Turned out a really good product, and everybody felt great about it. Another good project was a fact project that you did, Sabrina did, with Point Reyes. I was not on that project, but I heard about it. Where you had 6 people on the team?
Less than that, actually. There's
3 students and 3 alums.
You're right, yeah.
And they split it up so that each student was paired with an alum. And they had 3 very discrete aspects of the project for which the alums had particular knowledge and the students had particular interest. And so each of the students was paired up with somebody that was, really in sync with their interests and knowledgeable about what they were doing. And from everything I heard, you're nodding, it was a wonderful experience for everybody and turned out a great project. But I think all that starts with the scoping and the defining of what the project is, and then thinking about it in terms of how am I going to structure this? Let me make sure that the scope is such that I can break it down into units of work that make sense for a team. We also had a learning a couple of years ago, and this actually came after some fact projects were so heavily subscribed that we tried to force fit all the volunteers into staffing these teams. That was another problem with my project that died at the end, is we had too many people on it. Anyway, in staffing, it just had all kinds of problems. In trying to put too many people on the team, we observed across a number of projects that it became an unsatisfactory experience for the people in general. There was much less of a sense of individual responsibility. You can always pretend that someone else is going to be doing the job. They're pretending that you're doing it. Things don't get done as well, I don't think, if it's too big of a team compared with the right size or even maybe too small of a team. So I, from now on, will, and I think the ACT office has learned from that experience as well, that we will not try to force fit volunteers into teams because we recognize that in the long run that's just going to make frustrated volunteers. And one other thing I just want to touch on really briefly, and that is tools. We've tried a bunch of tools, and you guys might have in some of the projects that you've worked on, like Yahoo Groups and stuff. The only time I've ever found that to be helpful is in file sharing. And even then, it's kind of like not that great a deal. The one tool that I have used successfully, it was on the unsuccessful project, but it was a really successful tool, and we did do some good stuff with it, was if you're doing a survey, we have access to Zoomerang, and are we going to use a different one in the future? Or?
I think we're sticking with Zoomerang, but we also have SurveyMonkey. So.
But it's a web-based survey tool that we found really useful. It's easy for people to fill out so that they can. It's the same one as you use at the end of projects, so you guys are all familiar with taking them. But we can use those for our projects as well, and you get a lot of good data and a lot of cross-tabulation of stuff that can be very helpful. So that's the most effective tool that I've found in terms of actually running a project. So that's all I have.
Back to the sub-teams just for a minute. I'm a firm believer in sub-teams and assigning responsibilities. Back at the Y project, we had a terrific team. There was 7 of us. 3 of them were fact people. It was just really, really a good team. Everybody was dedicated and worked hard. And we had a lot of face-to-face interviewing to do, and I like to do 2 people interview teams. So we divided into 3 teams, 1 alumni and 1 fact person, and excluded myself, and then I filled in when somebody was out of town or there was a problem, and I could be a floater and jump in. And that process went very well, and I think it's important if you do have sub-teams to have somebody who's kind of the ad hoc leader and responsible for reporting back and make sure the team does its work and that sort of thing, so that takes care of itself. The interviews were very interesting. We began to uncover some problems. Dave mentioned the SAG factor thing in the center of the project. SAG factors are kind of like recessions. You know, if you're lucky, you get a V-shaped one, but more typically, it's a U-shaped one. And then there's the dreaded W. But be ready for them. Ours was kind of a multi-W exercise, and just kind of back at the ranch sort of thing. The first thing we found we started doing interviews was the staff morale was horribly low. One interview I was sitting in on, we were going along and talking to one of the project directors or program directors, and so I asked her and said, "Well, what's it like to work around here?" And she burst into tears. Abigail, the fact person, was busy. She felt so bad. And so that was a hint that maybe things weren't really too great there in the working environment. The next thing we found out was the financial guy was incompetent. We sat in on a board meeting because the board meetings were kind of a disaster area, so we were helping him out there. And so they asked him, well, how much more money we got? He says, well, we're going to run out of money somewhere between 60 and 180 days. And so that was another indication that perhaps things were not so hot there. They had no teamwork. They had a rape crisis center, which was one of their big profit centers, and they just put in a new director not too long before, who had been having a rough time and was not a team player and that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, employees, volunteers from the rape crisis center, were bringing charges against her for absconding with funds and picking on people and all kinds of things, and took it actually to the police department for an investigation. Now, this wouldn't have been so bad, except that the person who was being the new police chief that was going to be inaugurated in about 30 days was the first woman police chief that Palo Alto's ever had. It was a big deal. She was also a member and treasurer of the board of the YWCA. So she wasn't too thrilled about this whole deal coming out of nowhere. And so that was another little V-shaped hit. Then the next thing was we worked through a program, well, how are you going to get out of this mess? And got pretty good buy-in. Ran a survey and all that sort of thing of the 70 most influential people, which included the old ED who was the hero who had retired 5 years before, and a bunch of past presidents and the advisory committee, and about 70 people. And they all sent back their questionnaires and said, yeah, this looks like this is the way we want to go. And so we had a plan to go forward. I gave it about a 50-50 chance. And then the next thing we knew, a group of those past presidents and the old ED were initiating a recall on the present board because they didn't think they were managing very well. So this is floating around out there. Long story short, they decided to close the place down, and that became the end of the project. Interestingly enough, and this is coming full circle now, and where my question is, was this a good project or a bad project? We got a very good review. Everybody on the board, the bad guys, the good guys alike, said, gee, we're lucky you guys were here. We could think through this process and make a reasoned decision. we're not just kind of a knee-jerk going out of business sort of thing. And thank you. But we worked real hard, and was it rewarding for the team? I don't know. I felt good about it, but I know that somewhere in that series of W's, there was times when people are saying, and I think particularly the FAC people are saying, "What are we doing here?" And so that's the quandary that you find yourself in. If I had to do over again, I'd probably do the same thing. But it was at times it was fun. But you just wonder whether it was in the best interest of ACT and the best interest of the team. I'm convinced it was in the best interest of the organization. And you get back to the screenings. You take an organization who has a mission of empowering women and eliminating racism. In this day and age, that may work in Bangladesh or Kabul or maybe even Alabama. I'm not so sure it's really a good mission to have in Palo Alto now, in terms of the immediacy and the amount that it's pushing. How good it is as a mission. So lots of things going on there. But anyway, when you hit those things, it's not necessarily all bad, but be prepared because they're going to be there.
I guess a couple of comments I'd like to make. We're called project leaders for a reason, and so I think that no one should be shy about actually leading. There is a disease amongst Stanford GSB alums in particular, I think, where people are like, oh, no, you do it, and kind of not wanting to necessarily take a leadership role. Had that problem with our study groups, even back in school. And it's really important that you do take a leadership role, particularly because this is a volunteer thing, and while you have very bright people on your team, everyone is really, really busy, and somebody needs to keep the team on track. And it's important to actually do that. I mean, actually, this is the reason I became a project leader, because it was driving me nuts to be part of a project team where there was no leadership on the team. And your team will thank you for that. Down to administrative things like reminding people about team meetings. Yes, everyone has their Palm Pilot and it's in their schedule, but, life happens. You have a project deadline at work, you had a last-minute scheduled business trip, your kid is sick, whatever it is. It's nice to get those reminders and, a friendly poke sometimes to remind you that you're part of a group project and that we're counting on you. So I guess this all kind of comes down to really setting expectations with your team up front. And I actually like to do some screening of team members up front. This is a reflection of my personal style, but I like to call people one-on-one before the team meets as a group and really talk about what they expect to get out of this project and what kind of experience they've had before with ACT, what their availability and time commitment is going to be throughout the project. There are people who join these teams, and then you find out they're going to be gone for 3 months during the summer. So, these are good things to kind of understand up front. And at the same time, convey kind of what your expectations are as a project leader and kind of what participation you'd like to see from every team member. And you'll find that people will pretty much self-select up front. And this helps prevent dropouts later in the project when it really can be demoralizing for your team to have half the team drop out. So if you can do that in advance, I think it's helpful. And even if people, there are always people who don't really have a good sense of how much they really can commit, and it takes them a few meetings to discover this. But then at least they drop out early, and it doesn't really affect the work product of the team. So what I like to do at a first meeting is to go over the project work plan, get the buy-in at that point. Sometimes you'll have some really good ideas, have a discussion in the group, and if there's going to be any modification, try to get that done pretty much up front. I like to go through what are your expectations, why did you sign up for this project? I like to go around the room and ask that up front, get that public commitment thing going. And it's useful because it's a good thing to go over that at the end and see if we really met everyone's expectations. And people really do have different expectations. Some people are doing it because, they're bored with their jobs and they want to do something different. Some people do it because they want to meet other alums. There are actually usually a range of different reasons as to why people actually sign up for these things. I personally like to set regular meetings, and I know that there's some teams that meet once a month and on an ad hoc basis or decide on their next meeting at the end of each meeting. I personally like to set regular meetings, and I actually like to set weekly meetings, and part of it is to try to avoid the multiple W problem, so that you kind of have a deadline every week, and even if it's a small amount of work, you get to kind of spread that out during the month instead of what most people do if you have monthly meetings, is they do everything the week of that meeting or the night before sometimes. And it's just not possible to keep a project going that way, because if you have anyone who misses on something important, it throws the whole project off. So depending on the project, a meeting each week or every other week, and you time limit it, it's going to be 1.5 hours or maximum 2, so that people can just touch base. And part of the reason also is not only to keep the project going, but also to recognize that this is social for a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people are doing this to try to get to meet some GSB alums who are not in their class. And if you only see each other once a month on a 6-month project, you don't really get to know people that well. So if you have a regular meeting, it's a way for people to get to know each other and, learn about each other, and it becomes more rewarding for volunteers. I had a team when I was working on the Shanti project. It was a great team, and we had one guy who loved to cook and volunteered his place every week, and he made us dinner every week. It was great. Now, you can't always, be that lucky, but you can do other things.
Who was that? My next project.
It was awesome. But, what on my team currently, we don't do dinner, but we alternate at, people's houses, and one person's responsible for bringing snacks each time, and, you kind of share a meal together and you talk about your project, and it's just a lot more fun and social for everybody to do that. The other thing is, again, this is kind of a public commitment kind of thing, is to let people at the first meeting talk about what their time commitment is throughout the project. Because, some people have young kids, other people have horrendous jobs that they have to deal with. I mean, when I was working on the Japan Society, I had one team member who never made our team meetings because he was a management consultant. He was gone, during the week. And so we basically never saw him unless he was on the beach. And it was fine because we knew he wasn't going to make it, and he kept in touch via email, and he pulled out a big, important strategic piece at the end, and he contributed, and it was fine. But as long as everybody kind of knows that up front, there are going to be people who are not going to be able to put the same amount of time in, but still can contribute meaningfully. And I think that's fine because this is a volunteer thing, and that's going to, as long as everyone is okay with that on the team, that's all right. So, this project I'm working on now, you have the summer. So we had people scheduling summer vacations, and some of them were a couple of weeks. And so letting people know in advance, I'm going to be busy during this month, or whatever, is a good thing to kind of share that with the whole team. And like Dave said, it's about shared responsibility. So the more that everybody knows about it, the more responsible people feel. And I think that really helps prevent dropouts and prevent dropouts from affecting the morale of the people who decide to stay. And then, let's see, I want to talk a little bit about tools. I kind of agree, there's not a whole lot of tools that have been that useful. We did set up an FTP site for documents of file sharing, which has been useful, particularly for team members who are traveling. They can download it off the web, at least, if they don't have the computer, which has all their email attachments on it. I like to do interview templates so that more than one person can interview, and so that's first thing we do when we do interviews is we actually have people design an interview template, and then that's something the whole team can use. We do minutes to make sure that people who miss meetings can feel like they, can read the minutes and pretty much get the gist of what's going on. And action items are really clear. And what else would I like to say? I would say again in kind of the in line with what I was saying about don't be afraid to lead, do not be afraid to volunteer people for tasks. Generally what I like to do is say, well, here are the 5 things we need to do. Who would like to do what? And let people step up, because usually, if someone has particular interests, absolutely, let that person, do that particular task. But, one of the things you did in the beginning of defining your project is to say what skill sets you needed, and hopefully when you interviewed these people, you found out what their skill sets were, or in their introduction to the group, you found out what their background was, and you can say, hey, you have a lot of experience in organizational behavior. Why don't you take this part, So try to play to people's strengths. You don't have a whole lot of time. Again, this is a volunteer project, so, if somebody is not stepping up, then they might just need a little poke. By the way, Fred, you have all that great experience in customer evaluation. Why don't you take that? And, I think most people are totally fine with that. Sometimes it just doesn't occur to them or whatever. Or they can push back and say, I'm really busy this week. And, again, let the team figure out, who else can step up. And then I think the other thing I'd like to say is leave time to celebrate your accomplishments as a team. This is another thing to avoid those low spots. Definitely celebrate at the end of a project, but, along the way, too, if it's, something, again, you have to see the personality of your team. But when I worked on this Japan Society project for our final team meeting, we met at a karaoke bar and invited the executive director, and we sang songs for an evening, which seemed appropriate.